So the reason I'm coming to this topic of paradigm shifts is that I think the kind of change that I see necessary is significant. It's not tweaking the current system. It's not trying to make improvements here and make improvements there, which everyone's trying to do. I feel like a fundamental change has to happen, and it has to happen first in our thinking. I quoted Albert Einstein, who said, the world as we have created it is a process, he said, or a product of our own thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. And there's so big a paradigm, so many paradigms we can talk about. First, let's just talk a minute about what does the word paradigm mean? What is a paradigm shift to you?
I think for me, a paradigm means a sort of a outer structure in place of how we are viewing the world and viewing or how we're viewing anything. It's a system, so to speak, or a set of constructs of certain constructs, like our current paradigm as a capitalist, global capitalist kind of culture, which as Americans, we're part of that paradigm, is that you must always have a growth economy, you must always be growing. So within that paradigm of, capitalism and global capitalism, then there are these other sort of pieces that build around it, things like economy must always be growing and those kinds of thoughts.
And it also can come from like a discovery, like when everybody thought the world was flat, there was a certain belief system attached to it. And then once we realized, that's not how it is,
or that
things shifted.
Or that everything revolved around us and we did not revolve around the sun. That was a huge paradigm shift. Because we are the center of the universe. It's like, oh, shoot, no, we're not.
Paul, so paradigm shift, paradigms in belief is... we have these big frontal lobes on our brains, and so we find it very hard to make a shift, even when we have this sort of cognitive dissonance that we know that something is bad or is not true, but we still believe it. We like to think we live in a democracy.
Not so much.
Well, there's certainly been a lot of technological advances that shift our paradigm. Clearly we all see now how the internet and smartphones and how us all being able to take video and share with each other and this way of communicating has completely changed our social structure from what it was when we barely had a telephone or we used the Pony Express and email and all that. So that's a huge shift. Can we think of some others that over time have shifted?
Well, when we went from hunting and gathering to farming.
To agriculture.
Yes.
Yeah, that was probably the most impactful paradigm shift on human beings, and many people believe that was sort of the beginning of climate change. There's a lot of evidence and research being done on that actually it started then.
Well, one thing it allowed is the formation of cities. So before then, hunter-gatherer, like everyone had to have a role and a part in the food chain. So maybe the male
truest form of community
did the hunting and maybe the females did the gathering and then they did the food preparation. But it's like everyone was involved in that.
And it was more egalitarian, as you were saying, Bernie, in a way, too.
But then when agriculture came along, it said, I can do a farm here and provide food for lots of people besides the family that lives on the farm and works the farm. Now you can have people do other professions. So we became a civilization of people who had time to think about things, be philosophers, to be artists.
In actuality, hunter-gatherers had far more free time than when we went to an agricultural society.
Or than we have now.
And then we have now. And in going to that...
Which is none.
It was actually the creation, frankly, of military and war. Because once you stay in one place, then you have to claim that land.
And guard your borders.
You have to guard it. And then you own. The concept of owning property came about with that. And with that, you have armies, you have wars, you have, so really, Mary, I think that shift from hunter-gatherers to agricultural, and, DNA studies have shown that what happened too was the agriculturalists killed off the males, kidnapped the hunter-gatherer women. I mean, it was not we think of farmers as so nice and nice, sweet farmers, and we love our farmers. But the advent of farming was pretty violent and materialistic.
Well,
and
the herders from North Africa and from Mongolia were the ones who wiped out the partnership societies in the last remaining partnership societies in the Eastern Mediterranean back then, 7,000 years ago. So, yeah, it was the guys looking for more land to graze their herds on, right?
I think that
it
property...
all comes back to grazing again, huh? Sore subject here.
That property ownership for me is indeed fundamental. It's taken me a long time to sort of change my thinking to see that that's endemic of our whole civilization's problem. And I'm a realtor, and I deal in helping people buy and sell real estate and get title insurance, and I own this, and et cetera.
So you're in the belly of the beast there.
But I think that ultimately it's created this concept of everyone wanting more, whether it be real estate property or whether it want things like iPhones and or a car or or money. Money is part of property, and then we have the rights to the mineral rights or the fossil fuel rights or the forests or the fish, and we sell and we license and we do all these things to allow people to continue to build their personal wealth. And as we have a bigger and bigger population all striving for what we call a higher standard of living, we all want more things. We all want to use more energy. We all want to eat better foods. We all want to travel the world. We want to have the mobility and all of that. And I think we accept that in our culture, the only way can be, except that we can find still cultures on this planet that are living in an indigenous society where individuals don't own things. The tribe has this hunting ground that they consider theirs, but as individuals, one doesn't say, where you put your teepee is my ground and you owe me $100 a month. That doesn't happen in indigenous culture.
I don't think that alone builds greed. I think it's a mindset. It doesn't just come from owning a house. I mean, when I look at the real threat to the environment, for example, what is the real threat? Greed, apathy, and selfishness. So that's a mindset. Where does that come from? Where is it cultivated? What nourishes that? And what breaks that down and opens up a more compassionate and fair mindset?
Well, I can agree that the mindset is like a paradigm that you can change. And so people have indeed tried to say, we're going to have an intentional community here where we share as much as possible, and we're going to be in a cooperative spirit more than in a competitive spirit, so that the idea of one person gaining at a win-lose situation at the other person's expense is not going to drive this community. And I think that's a good way for that paradigm to exist. But I don't think it's – some people want to believe that we have some human frailty of greed or whatever. I think humans have shown that it's depending on the culture. Right. You can have a sustainable culture or you can have one that's exploitive. And we have an exploitive culture.
Well, I think when you look at the concept, first of all, if you talk to, and if you've been to any of Derek Jensen's things where he's had, her name went out of my head. She's a Lakota woman from Minnesota, and the concept of ownership is alien in the paradigm of indigenous people, and it's not even that this is the area that we hunt together. These are our grounds. They almost all indigenous groups, they consider themselves to be part of an area that they're not. That they're actually part of it, like they're
not
like
superior.
in Lakota tradition, that we are the protectors and keepers of these lands. So that
it isn't just the lands; it's the whole universe.
Yeah, and so the mindset is we are this. This is we are this. This is us.
There
so
is no separation.
It's not even like what we do, like wilderness area. So keep humans out and then go over here and be polluting or whatever. They're actually, it's not even just these are the lands we all share. It's that we belong to the land. Right. The land owns us in a sense, or
in the European settler belief paradigm, that didn't make sense.
No.
They didn't understand it until somebody suggested, I'm guessing, to the indigenous peoples, if you say it's sacred to you, then we might understand what that means. Instead of just being, we are this, They have to say it's sacred to us because otherwise Europeans don't get it.
But and Europeans still didn't respect that. It's like, well,
No,
go make
yeah,
Oklahoma sacred. We're taking over this wonderful wooded area. You go live in the desert. Make that sacred.
To Mary's point, in those indigenous cultures that you're talking about, Robin, I believe that if you came back as a hunter and you wanted to hoard your thing, you were shamed. The community did not accept this notion that you didn't share with the village, and that if someone was sick, we all chipped in to help that person. I mean, it was a total let's help ourselves as a tribe. But you're so right. Also, it was connecting with the land. We've been separated from the land so much. In terms of our paradigm. Our food comes from the Palace Market in shrink wrap form, so we have a whole different view of where everything comes from because it's been intermediated by corporations.
Bernie, an interesting point about that, about being shamed, about having too much. In many indigenous tribes in the Americas, they would hold something called a potlatch, potlatch. And a potlatch was when you began to have too much stuff or more than you needed. You would spread it out on blankets in front of your
garage
teepee or
sale?
home. It's not a
no
sale.
charge.
You give it away. Give it away. And then that was considered also a sign of you got kudos and respect for that because you were being generous and you were not hoarding. So, that. But what was very interesting, the American government outlawed potlatches in the 1800s because it was said because it was counter to what the American spirit and way, that it was a very counterproductive thing, and they knew it was dangerous. We can't have. So this is interesting. They saw that paradigm and mindset of being shamed for hoarding and having too much and being greedy, that we can't have that existing. That they literally, Canada and the U.S. outlawed it and did not allow indigenous peoples to hold potlatches, to give their things away.
Very good. So far, no callers yet. I was afraid that this might not be a topic, but that a lot of people care to weigh in on. But there's so many examples, and we've hit on some good ones already.
Well, one of the things you were talking about earlier, Bernie, before the show is, okay, so what can we do if we feel like the paradigm we're in isn't working? How can we really, if we're making changes, and this election right now, I think really calls that up. If you're making the changes within the system, can it really be a real change? Don't you have to break down part of the system to have real change?
I thought about that a lot and before the show, and I was thinking about, was there another time in history that I am familiar with or knew about or heard about where it seemed like we were circling the drain, where it was like all was lost. We're going to be gone in 100 years or less. And, what things came to mind? And my ancestors and relatives came to mind because of the Holocaust.
Yes. And
there, of course, was a time when everybody thought it was all over. It was completely all over. And what did those people do? I thought about, what about the people who didn't do anything, where terrible horrors were taking place even next door, and they turned the other way? And then what were the characteristics of those people who did something, who jumped in, who tried? And
let me speak to that, because I was born in Germany to German parents. My dad was in the military, in the Navy during the war and before, so some people call him a Nazi. And I remember hearing stories from my parents as they met with other Germans and talked about that period. And it was an overwhelming fear that they would not even use the word Jude, which is Jew in German, for conditioning of not saying the word. Yeah. And they would talk about so-and-so, there was a knock in the door, and they just didn't want to know. It was sort of we know nothing, we see nothing. And I found it really sad and depressing and hard for me to accept. And what I took away is, in my life, I'm not going to say nothing. So when I see the destruction of other species and our own species and the planet, I feel it's just like you're saying, is a parallel here.
Yeah, but
there are people who resisted and others who didn't.
Yes, and if you look at the people that resisted, they were brave enough and courageous enough to envision the worst possible outcome. What does that enable you to do? Set priorities. If this is a possibility, what can I do? It makes you know what's the most important thing for you to do right now.
Right.
And the resistance was in so many different levels. Everybody did all kinds of different things. But for people who say, what can we do? Look what's going on. We have no power and blah, blah, blah. But I wouldn't be here if groups of people didn't do little things maybe that maybe people saw as not so much. But if enough people do a little things, you can save a planet.
I just want to react a little bit to the people that didn't do this, what can I do, and characterizing it as them being weak. I think those people felt truly powerless by the structure that was in place.
Sure,
they
fair.
feared the Gestapo and everybody else as much as the Jews did. I mean, maybe they didn't have to fear it, and they were privileged, and they were like, in this country, whites who aren't understanding what Black Lives Matter movement is about and what blacks still experience in this country, not stepping up. So it's very hard. I wouldn't want to be too harsh on the people, but I would want to say that, again, the paradigm that Hitler tapped into was to grab national power and control sort of a military and a manufacturing base and sort of set it up that he could indeed become the fascist dictator. If this idea of national sovereignty did not exist. We've all sort of bought into it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. All of this idea that somehow the United States with its what was that doctrine of eminent
domain?
Some other
Monroe Doctrine.
Monroe Doctrine. Yeah. This sort of notion that we are the rightful rulers of this land.
And the concept of exceptionalism.
Yeah,
We're exceptional.
It's all nonsense. So we don't really need a United States of America to exist. When Europeans first came to North America, there were maybe 500 different tribes and local people with different languages, slightly different cultures. There was diversity. This is the kind of thing evolution likes, not a monoculture of one Congress, one Supreme Court, and one president making all the decisions for everybody.
Didn't you fight a civil war about this, states' rights?
Well, I didn't fight it. I wasn't around then.
I was going to circle back around to what you were saying, Bernie, about and what Mary was referring to, and what it is like to be in a system where suddenly things go very dark and scary. And what is it like, and what some people can do and some people can't do. And what it's like, just say you're a young couple and you have 2 young children and you don't want the SS or the not, you're trying to protect them. You're trying, and when you see that change really needs to happen, what I see happening here, one of the scariest things I think in America, and I really appreciate the fact that Bernie Sanders brings this up quite a bit, but the intense militarization of our police force has really only happened in the past 15 to 20 years. And it is an amazingly huge difference. And I lived in Richmond, right across the bay for a while, and I was very blessed to be there at the time frame when Green Party Mayor McLaughlin came on board, and we brought in Police Chief Chris Magnus. And Chris had a very different view. And Richmond was, there were shootings all the time. We had the tent city movement of getting the grandmas out there and setting up tents in the fly zones of the bullets because they were like, you're going to shoot your grandmas. We were trying everything we could in the city to stop the violence. And, Chris came in and he had a completely different viewpoint. He knew immediately he had to get rid of the bad apples in the force. He knew immediately there had to be a culture shift. And, this is this person that I watched in 2 years, an amazing shift happen. And it was about the mindset there. And what we're seeing across the country, and it's horrifying even to my very super conservative Republican and right-wing family members, the militarization of the police force and the fact that they've been being sold all kinds of arms and military gear. And so when you see, I know when I was working down on a campaign down in Florida and I was working in neighborhoods of color, and when those cops would come in, you can't imagine how scary that is. And so as that starts to bleed more and more into our culture, I think that's one side of things that is really pushing us down from speaking up for shift.
Sure.
I think policing, if you look at, have there always been police? No. When were police first introduced into our culture? Mostly it was to keep these revolting workers who were being exploited by the ruling class, the manufacturing magnates, etc. So police forces were putting down union organizers, etc., as a way to get started. And the police never really worked for the common man. They've always worked for the elite to protect property. Just like from what I've learned and seen, Supreme Court, our constitution's all about protecting property rights more than it is about protecting the rights of the poor individual. And with the policing, I think a local effort for security amongst the people for themselves that's that community policing model, as you're saying. It's being there. And whenever you have like a big white force that doesn't live in Ferguson, policing Ferguson, it gets out of hand where the majority of the
And once you give boys with toys, you give those men all this fancy military gear and stuff, and it does. I remember my father saying this to me one time when I briefly dated someone who was a police officer, and he said, "Honey, when you are given a gun every day and you go to work and your job is to get stuff done and is backed up by a gun, it does something to your mind." And he said, "You can't stay." He believed you couldn't stay a mentally healthy person. My dad was in the Marines, and my dad's a hunter, but he was like, if your job description includes a gun does most of your work, it's going to mess you up in some way. He was like very firm about that.
And now they're actually trained in military tactics. It's not, you don't shoot somebody to disable them, you shoot to kill.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is that we are all guilty until proven innocent, and
if we're black,
they'll deal out frontier justice, right? I mean, it's like the Great West. Yeehaw! Well, it's another ridiculous paradigm.
Let me tie back into the resistance that Mary was talking about, that goes back to the Holocaust. And, in this country, we had J. Edgar Hoover playing with his power to push against, the civil rights movement, to push against individuals and unions probably, et cetera. And we see that still happening. We see FBI, or like when the New York police department had a special unit that went into mosques to try to see, identify terrorists. And they still infiltrate various groups that are about exercising free speech and offer any notion of resistance. It's all of a sudden, is it un-American? Is it terrorists? And that continues. And the real damage is done at that national level, because that's also where the military equipment that was upgraded for the military, and now they had this surplus. That's what was made available to all the legal. Of course, a local department's going to say, "We'd love to have one of those really big vehicles that can run over houses."
Don't you remember when it was, Paul? Was it like about 6 months ago? There was something action going. And they brought in these tanks.
Well, they have the sheriff's department has a Bearcat. Yeah, it's an armored vehicle. Yes, it doesn't have guns on it. I don't think it's just an armored personnel carrier kind of thing. But it's
but I thought there was
formidable to see this thing coming down the street.
But again, here comes back to a willingness of everybody resists change. With the rudder set in a certain way, and it's always been that way, and it'll always be that way, and to step out of that requires a lot of courage.
Sure, poking your head up.
Yeah, you're poking your head up, and it also means you may be in many very uncomfortable situations. But I think that's what the times call for right now. I'm going to just quote Michael Meade here, who is a fantastic mythologist, and he reminds us that the inner-seated story of the individual soul is secretly tied to the great drama of our world. And so this is all part of the story. And if you're willing to step into it and be a part of it, your ability to stretch and grow, your willingness to help others can make a huge difference.
I want to comment on, some of us have a luxury here, probably 4 of us. I know I do. I have the luxury of having time in my day to think about these things, to comment on them, come into a show about them and stuff. And I look at my kids, and they're struggling in the day-to-day of paying the rent, having food on the table, and they don't have this luxury. And so they generally don't want to talk to me about what I want to talk about. They don't want to talk about paradigm shifts.
Here comes scary Grandpa.
Well, because the truth is, to get along in this world, you have to immerse yourself in this dominant paradigm to have an existence, to pull out of it, like Derek Jensen. He has pulled out. He lives somewhere in the northeast of California in the redwoods and writes for a living, etc. He's not faced with that day to day like many people are. I think we do need those people. I think we need people like us to help raise awareness, to spread a message. I'm not ready to condemn the general populace for not being there, but I'm hoping that this awareness that we're talking about keeps growing and that people will someday not look to, is it better to have Hillary or to have Donald or to have Bernie, but think about, let's get rid of that whole system. We don't need any of that. We don't need even the Constitution. So many people consider the Constitution inviolate. So many people consider the stock market as the temple that we all must worship at. So many people think money is the absolute necessity of life. Well, it is. I mean, today, try to get along without money. But there could be a day. I try to imagine a world where, let's say, the electricity went out for a week globally. Where would people's money be? Would they be little electrons flopping on the bank floor? I mean, where would people's wealth be? Where would we be if we had a whole week globally of no electricity?
It's interesting. I don't know if any of you've watched this show called Mr. Robot, which was a fabulous, fabulous show. And at the end of the series, the whole thing was a group, and I think we should come around to Anonymous and hackers and that whole world as disruptors to the paradigm. But in this show, what they're doing, they've got some of those brilliant hackers on the planet together, and they realize if they can erase and go in and one time go in and where the servers are, erase all banking records around the globe, erase them all, then there will be no more debt. No banks can come after you. The only people that will really be hurt are the ones with billions of dollars, because everyone else, all your credit card debt, your student loan debt, your mortgages, whatever you have stays in place, but you're out of debt. And so it totally changed the planet in this particular
I like that
series.
This is KWM.
So we're talking about paradigm shifts today. Mary, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Robin said, that I love the idea of just wiping out all of the...
And there was no way to get it back. It was gone.
Yes, but there's another piece here, I think, which is that we have to awaken to our humanity. Because if you just end everything, what do you rebuild it with? You can't rebuild it with the same mindset of non-community, of greed, of selfishness. There has to be an awakening to your humanity. We've seen it in other cultures. It's possible. They've lived for thousands of years that way. We have to learn that. And we don't know how to do that. But we can start by remembering that we're not alone and that we can't create alone. And that everything that we see was a product of somebody's imagination. And I'm sorry. And if we nourish that part of our humanity, there's no telling what can happen. I mean, but things can change in the blink of the eye. Look what Steve Jobs did. He changed everything in basically the blink of an eye. And that can be done on a humanistic level as well.
I think that there's a lot of wisdom to the idea that we should be now thinking about accepting that a collapse will happen, and when it happens, to not freak out jumping off the bridge because your money went to zero, like some people are prone to do, and think their life is over because the one thing that they were so attached to was their wealth, and now that status is gone, and find out that we are all able to communicate and cooperate at that human level that you're talking about. And I think it's really important that we not fall into the trap to believe there's only one way to structure a modern modern society. That is what is the tendency is let's get back. We just lost something. Let's fix that. Let's get back to the same treadmill that we're on. And if we come to an awareness and an understanding that the treadmill itself must be thrown out and a whole nother vision that won't depend on that money or those banks or the debt, and that you don't even need to take a student loan to attend a university that's just teaching you how to be a cog in an unsustainable system, that your learning could take place at home more in interaction with other species in the woods, with other people, having that awareness of how within us is not only that feeling of need and want for ourselves, but that innately in humans is that ability to have empathy and compassion and cooperation. It just needs a system that rewards it and lets that flourish rather than crushes it.
Yes, and that can, again, begin on an individual level, because it's a ripple effect.
Yeah.
If you teach your kids that, or if you behave that way in work or whatever, it's amazing the effect that can have. And it does start there, because we don't start with the big system. We start with ourselves, who are connected to everybody else.
It reminds me of one of my all-time favorite movies was the movie A Year of Living Dangerously. And I don't know if you guys remember that movie, but there's a journalist there who's the observer of revolution and death and some terrible things going on. And I think it was in Indonesia. I can't remember exactly the setting. But there was a photographer, Billy Kwan, who he was helping a young woman who had a very sick child. And he was doing these little things in the villages. And one night, having drinks with the journos, he expressed that his feeling about how, and they were like, this is so depressing. And how do you change this? This revolution's failing. This person's being assassinated. And he said, you do it, you fix what's right next to you. Mm-hmm. If every person would just fix one thing right next to them, that ripple out effect, it's not the big revolutionary thing. It's that, what he was doing to try to help this young woman and her child. It's what any of us as humans can fix right next to us or help right next to us. That if we were all doing that, and by human nature, I think most humans, that is our nature to want to help.
Sure. Community. We're communal animals. Right?
Well, one big paradigm shift that's happened in our culture is the institution of marriage has, changed our view. Women working outside of the home, women having equal rights, women having control of their reproductive systems. These are ideas that didn't exist for a long time. There was a paradigm that was very patriarchal, that was very religiously oriented to a certain paradigm, like And children were raised, and obviously people believed strongly that was the right way to live. The man, head of the household, the woman, go have babies, make the food, et cetera, et cetera. So we've broken that stereotype wide open in this country. Yet we, for example, still have marriages still between two people, not between three. In other words, the government is still always there.
And humans always crave a system too, though. I mean, as humans, we do crave some sort of story we follow.
The legal context in which we live has gotten so exponentially complex that we keep building more statutes, more law, more nuance about this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong, this is allowed, this you go to jail for. We have created this superstructure that we're all trying to live in, and then we constantly want to fix that because there's an injustice being felt by that system. And I suggest that we have way too much law, that we should really reduce law much more at a local level.
Like 10 Commandments. Or how about the law is...
No, I don't want any universal law.
Are you hurting someone? Then stop it. Are you hurting yourself? Then stop it.
Yeah,
like two laws.
I'd be willing to just leave it to the local council of elders to ultimately make the decisions where there's conflict that comes before them, and it's their job to help resolve the conflict.
That would be us, by the way.
We have a very good example of a new system, a relatively new system, talking about system, that throws out the old paradigm, doesn't pay attention to borders, and is an incredible new business model, if you can call it a business model, and that's the organization Medicine Without Borders, Doctors Without Borders.
Yes.
Because they have created a whole new paradigm. And it's thrown out the old business strategy. It's built community. It does incredible work, and it's a new model.
They've been bombed by the United States, which means they must be doing something right.
Well, I agree that that's a great example of them busting out of the medical establishment and the insurance model that we're in. I mean, the whole medical of modern medicine is a paradigm. Some people believe, well, it's the ultimate, it's the best. Western medicine exceeds everything. Well, that can be challenged because some indigenous cultures, which are not as nearly as technologically advanced, and still believe that you eat this leaf when you have this malady or whatever, they may not live as long. But they're living in a different paradigm that is not bad, because it shouldn't all be keeping as many people alive as long as possible if the net result is overpopulation and us decimating the other species of the planet. Looking to these indigenous cultures who lived much more simple lives with a lot less complicated laws. And I'm not for having one law for the universe, for the planet, because, again, that's monoculture thinking. Evolution is not served. Human evolution is best served when there are many cultures coexisting on the planet and sort of competing genetically for what will ultimately be the future humans.
Yeah, and that requires an acceptance of people living who are different.
Absolutely.
And egoless conversations without agenda. And these are two qualities that are not encouraged right now in our culture.
I went to a day-long event that Deep Green Resistance did about 5 or 6 years ago. And they had several
Were you
speakers.
at the one in Berkeley or the one in San Francisco?
The one in San Francisco.
I was there, too.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Bernie, Bing was there with us.
Yeah. Well, and Robin.
Yeah, Andy and I and Bing. You were there, too? Okay.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was fascinating.
Maybe you went to the very first one. I did not go to that one.
It was.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
one early in the morning. We had to have security because we were trying to attack Lara Keats because she was no longer vegan. Anyway, long story short. So we, Bing and Andy and I are like sneaking in through the fog at 6 a.m. And so one of the people that he had speak, the different speakers were there to speak about how do we create a revolution? How do we push and create for faster collapse of the things that are hurting our planet? And he had a mythologist, a woman who is a well-known mythologist and storyteller, to come and talk about, with revolution, if we're going to have a revolution, if we're going to collapse the current system, one of the things that we have to have, one of the important things to have new societies healthy, are the mythologists and storytellers. Because just like how all tribes, and they had, once again, I'm so sorry, I can't remember her name, the Lakota tribe member and activist, talking about like her people have their stories, and so us white people, colonialists that have come in, and her people and all the other indigenous cultures that have managed to hang together will have their stories. But we'll have to create our own stories and our own mythologies in order, because you can't have a society and a coming together and a new thing without creating some story for it.
But, this can also be tied to respecting our elders and acknowledging the fact that they've been through hell in their lives. They have a lot of wisdom. They've been through many, many hard times. And, we may not have those stories, but they do have their stories. We just have to listen to them. There's such a disrespect, not in general, but in many that don't respect that tapping into the wisdom of the people that have gone before us, no matter what color they are, has tremendous benefits. This is KWMR's weekly Let's Talk call-in show with co-host Paul Raffel, Robin Carpenter, Bernie Steffen, and me, Mary Frank. To join our conversation, please call us at 415-663-8492 or tweet us at Let's Talk on KWMR.
And fortunately, we got a caller.
And we have a tweet, too. The tweet came in first. So Murray says, can you speak of the danger of abruptly overturning paradigms? Revolutions can have unpredictable results. And the caller. Hi, caller. You're on the air. What's your name, please?
Hi, this is Sandy.
Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Sandy.
Hi. I was listening to you talk about the medical paradigm that exists, and I've recently come across somebody called Eric Pearl. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yes, he's wonderful.
And this is a completely new paradigm in healing that is apparently has been around for not a huge amount of time, but it's been shifting. And the idea behind this is that the whole universe is shifting into a new frequency, a vibrational frequency, and that each of us has the power to adjust by connecting with this. And he's referring to it as the reconnection. It's a very interesting concept, and it's a little out there, but it's definitely something that people need to know about, and I think that this is going to be the thing that shifts the world into a completely different gear.
Sandy, does it help you see things in a new way?
Well, I have to say that I have somewhat been involved in this kind of thing for a long time, but yes, it certainly gives me hope that the whole universe is going to shift into a more advanced, shall we say, frequency of thinking.
And describe a little bit. Tell us a little bit what that looks like.
Well, it's mainly on a health level of being able to heal oneself and to heal others, based on the premise of the Einstein energy and matter being the same, the E equals mc squared. That energy and matter are one and the same, and that medicine in general in the future is going to be based on the energetic way of healing.
Yes, and we see that already with the homeopathy, with Reiki. It's already acupuncture. It's already making inroads.
One of the things, Sandy, that I think is interesting, because you're talking about seeing something new coming in. Mm-hmm. And for me, a big health shift I had was when I first moved to the Bay Area in the 80s, adopting acupuncture and Chinese medicine, which was very ancient, had been around a much, much older paradigm. And so, looking at shifts can be something like what you're saying, is moving forward to something completely new, or sometimes going back and reaching back for something very ancient.
Well, this is what he claims. He says it is very ancient. And in fact, you'd have to read the book to kind of get there slowly and read it according to his unfolding of what he says. But he talks about, he himself was a chiropractor, and he talks about actually discovering that instead of 2 strands of DNA, people used to have a lot more, and that there's going to be some sort of a shift in allowing more. Now, this is just out there. I shouldn't even.
No, I happen to agree with you. Don't say that.
Sandy, what is the name of his book?
He has 2. The first one is called, I think, just The Reconnection, which is in essence saying that this is old and is going back, and it's a connection with essentially a universal consciousness that is going to be imparted one person at a time, and through this method, it's very, very simple. It exists in all of us actually already. The second book he wrote is called Solomon Speaks, which I haven't read yet.
Well, Sandy, we're really delighted that you called in today and shared your example of a great paradigm shift that we can look forward to.
Yes, I look forward to it too, because it's going to throw all our old ways of healing pretty much, except for, like you say, homeopathy. And I actually am a homeopath, so I do know what you're talking about. But healing is going to be something that is so completely and utterly different, and not based on this Western medical paradigm of make as much money as you can and exploit people and actually poison them along the way.
Yeah, it's
Very
basically
good.
become a business. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for the thoughts, Sandy. And let me go back to Murray, and maybe this can be tied in, because Murray suggests that if we have a major paradigm shift, it's going to be revolutionary in some way. And of course, people will be upset, people will probably die and be hurt, and it'll have a lot of disruption, no question.
Bernie, you said that Derek had made a shift in his, because Derek was really in Deep Moon Resistance, was calling for create collapse it faster. But you said in some of your later readings and stuff, Derek thinks we can maybe have more transition.
Yeah, I know the first conference that he called, and I was drawn to it, and I remember you and Bing going, and I went to later ones. And the third one, which was like several years later in San Francisco, he talked about putting less emphasis on the trying to bring down the current civilization, the idea that we need to monkey wrench it, that there were key places, like you could go to the Port of Oakland and stop a lot of trans-Pacific shipping by, shutting down the terminal. But I think that he recognized, first of all, that wasn't getting much support, and it was sort of getting in the way of people thinking for a new paradigm. So,
yeah, I like what the I Ching says about how do you combat evil? Energetic progress in the good. And related to that, for me, is that given the fact that we are all connected, all of us are connected, one of the most revolutionary things anybody can ever do is hold a positive vision.
But I'm going to play the devil's advocate here and say that, we didn't get rid of slavery without a bloody, bloody civil war. And there was a survey recently that 20% of Southern Republicans don't think slavery was such a bad thing. So, sometimes when things are really bad and really evil, you have to work, like in World War II, the resistance. You've got to find, so how do we, I don't know, Paul, you step in.
Well, in Britain, slavery was just abolished. There wasn't a civil war over it. They abolished it. They said we're not going to be involved in the slave trade anymore.
But we're Americans.
Resistance.
We don't do things logically like that.
There's a paradigm.
No one's saying no resistance.
Yeah.
So resistance in what form? And different forms will have to be tried, etc.
But if we know capitalism and growth economies are what's killing the planet, that's a collapse. If you're saying stop that system,
I think that,
but maybe not. Maybe
I don't
look at
think
parts of it.
I don't think we can stop it by conventional means. I think number one is we need to get our thinking outside of that box. We got to get some perspective on the big picture, and that's what we're talking about here. And number two is welcome the collapse that is inevitable. I come from math and physics and those kinds of studies and computers, and it's absolutely clear to me that this model that we have of capitalism with its growth paradigm running up against the national limits is already unraveling. It's already bumping in all those limits. And peak oil is an example of that. It's not the only thing, but the cheap energy that has fueled this complex industrial global system, when that runs out and the cost of fossil fuels becomes extraordinarily high, that'll force it from being so global to being more local. And then I think it's us being ready. And when we talk about healing, there is this aspect of we need to be prepared to grieve the loss of what we so cherish right now. There's so much that will be lost that people are very attached to. And I think that the real healing can't start until we sort of grieve and acknowledge that
the extinction rates and the things we're losing that our grandchildren will never see.
And they will continue. In other words, there's a guarantee, as you're saying, future generations will not have as much biodiversity, but maybe they'll have more cultural diversity. See, I'm a big believer in evolution needing mutations, needing that diversity, and even in a societal sense. We've always looked to, we want one wise man at the head of the UN or one wise woman at the head of the United States to make everything right and lead us in the right direction again. That's not what evolution cherishes, this hierarchical model. Evolution likes that diversity, many cultures, many languages. We're losing languages. There's a paradigm. Obviously there used to be hundreds of thousands of languages, and now there's maybe, 1,000, but there's only like 5 or 6 that are broadly throughout the world. And that's a loss of diversity that fortunately, some indigenous tribes are hanging on to that. They're teaching their young their language and their cultural ways. I see that as an absolute good thing in terms of building resilience, because we've been chasing efficiency. Efficiency causes centralization, standardization.
And profit. We've been chasing profit.
Yeah, efficiency means we can all profit from it by having more things. So it's not just the CEOs or the shareholders, it's also the consumers. We have benefited from the idea that if things are made cheaply in a foreign country and brought back here as an import item, we get more of them. And so we all as consumers...
But then we're whining because we've lost jobs.
Yeah, exactly. We're whining, and will need to grieve because we've spent our lives investing in this system. We've gone to schools, we've gone to training, work training, job experience, and career building, and all that stuff on a certain model, that when that model no exists, and indeed, like if the money becomes worthless, there's got to be grieving.
Well, there does, but it's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
You have to grieve because, what is it? 40% of all species have been lost in the last
that's what I
20
grieve. I grieve
years.
the planet.
In the last
Yeah.
20 years, the diversity has gone down by 40%.
Yes.
And
That
it's
gives-
continuing daily.
Yeah.
daily.
But here's the other side of the double-edged sword. We have to keep our sense of wonder and
Yes.
appreciation for the beauty that is here, for the love that is here, because that inspires creativity, that inspires the imagination, which inspires solutions.
You know, it's interesting. I had friends of mine, after a number of friends and family who lost their homes after Katrina, and several of them expressed in different ways the sentiment of how they had lost everything. There wasn't a family picture left. There was barely a foundation left. Everything. And they had nothing. And they were telling me they felt so guilty because they were so happy. They felt so free. Nobody was coming after them for the bills or the pay this or the pay that, or there was nothing to take care of. I mean, they had their wallets, and their kids and a few things, and that there was this. They had been removed from the system. They were temporarily removed from it all. And even though people had died, Katrina was so horrible because thousands of people died, and that they felt this sense of complete freedom and happiness and presence, and that it was almost like a sacred thing, and that their kids were happier.
Yeah, because you remember what's important.
Yeah.
You finally remember what's important.
So freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose.